Hi, I'm Amy Medford. Welcome to our show today. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Laurie Altman, composer, pianist. His most recent work with his group Bright Moments, featuring vocalist Jackie Jones, is about to be released on CD on Muse Records. It is titled Part of Me. He is currently preparing a commission piece for a live ballet which will be performed by Bright Moments and is premiering with the Carolyn Dorfman Dance Company at Rider University in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. Welcome, Laurie.
Thank you, Amy. Nice to be here.
Laurie, you were born in the jazz mecca of the world, New York City. How did literally growing up in the jazz clubs influence you?
Well, the jazz world that I grew up in, or the New York City that I grew up in, was the 1950s. And things, I think, in those days were extremely different than they are now. I recall we lived 4 blocks from the Village Vanguard, which at that time had a jazz policy where from Sundays at 4 to 7 they had a matinee, and I could sit over there all by myself with a Coca-Cola or a glass of milk. And it was there that I, of course, began to see some of the greats of jazz, Miles Davis, Mingus, Monk, some of the greats who had played there. And as well, was able to frequent clubs like the Half Note, which is no longer in existence, the 5 Spot where Monk played all the time, those primary clubs, plus a number of other places as well. So it obviously had a profound influence on a young kid who, even at the age of 11, had already started playing jazz.
You are one of a select group of composers that write both jazz and classical music. Is there a difference in your approach to each musical form?
Well, you know, it's curious because I don't know whether to define myself as a jazz composer who's seduced by classical music or a classical composer who's seduced by jazz. I think in some respects I became a better composer, regardless of idiom, when I allowed the jazz influence, in effect, to sort of become a part of my music. The preliminary forays into classical music as a college student in New York City tended to be, I think, as I look back at them now, professorial pieces, music I wrote for my professors. They were full of form without any substance. And in 1972, I did a work for a Lincoln Center Fellowship grant that I had received called Pulses, and it was the first piece that inculcated a lot of the jazz elements that had always been part of me because I was a jazz pianist at that point in time. And I suddenly found a kind of richness, both harmonically and rhythmically, that replaced a certain kind of stridency and academic sort of feel that the music had previously had. And so I think that anybody who hears my classical music is going to know that I'm a jazz person, and I think it just makes the music better.
That sounds wonderful. In your recent performance in Princeton with bassist Ken Filiano, I was very impressed by the beautiful interaction that you had with each other. How do you achieve this?
You know, it's an interesting kind of an observation because Ken and I have not really played together. I mean, this was the first occasion for us to play together. And in fact, we sort of sat looking at the music for a half hour up at Rutgers, and then he came over to my house for about an hour before the concert, and we ran through everything. What's remarkable, I think, for jazz musicians sometimes is that there's a sort of kind of symbiosis that occurs with individuals who are able to push a certain kind of button because of the discipline that they've developed over all these years. And you find a simpatico which results simply because of certain nuances in the way the chord changes flow or certain rhythms in the whole thing. You respond to a bass player who A, is able to read the material reasonably easily without going over it and saying, you know, picking it apart as he is. And it was an extraordinary kind of occasion to play with him and to find that so soon after we had gotten together were we able to start to create some kind of communication. So what's exciting about that is the notion that if we can do that in a short period of time, you know, down the road playing some more concerts, you know, it would be that much more exciting. So it was terrific. Music, it's funny, I said this to somebody once, music in a certain sense begins with a physical as opposed to a visual response. I mean, there's actually a need. It's almost as if it's a particular kind of thing. You respond to hunger within you. I respond to a certain kind of, I think it's a vapidness, an emptiness inside of myself, which is a direct byproduct of not being engaged in that process. You know, it's wonderful to say at this point in the juncture of my life that I wake up still with this wonderful realization that the very thing that I discovered when I was 10, that writing music was such a great pleasure, is still that much of a joy to me now. So that was enormously exciting. But it starts from this physical urge, this notion that you want to, you know, I just feel I have to write music. And then it sort of moves itself out from a kind of noodling. You know, as an improviser, I always start with a noodle at the piano, a genesis, or sometimes the idea is in my head, and I sort of commit it to paper, and then I work from that. Visual images do occur to me, colors, the coloring of a mood, for example, I tend to think of. And then I think the other thing that much of my music is also a response to is people, individuals. I tend to respond. I've written an enormous number of pieces that have been responsive to both the words of individuals, those would be settings of things, as well as just people who pass through my life.
That's wonderful. You mentioned improvisation, and improvisation is the essence of jazz music. Is this an ability that you're born with, or is it something that's developed?
Well, I mean, I was born into a home where music was an integral part of that house. So, I mean, you obviously have to start with that particular kind of notion. Because of listening a great deal at the jazz club level as a kid, as I alluded to earlier, as well as just listening. I mean, I had an extensive record collection, and I had a jazz group by the time I was 11. So obviously one seeks, as a creative individual, a certain kind of a voice. My voice, as I subsequently had found out, was that I was not content merely to play classical music, to reproduce or to interpret that which was in front of me. The excitement that I discovered even as a kid was this realization that, you know, there you are on this tightrope, and you're never quite sure how it's going to work out. And the beauty of it, when it works, it puts you in touch so much with your creativity. And when it doesn't work, it provides you with the impetus to get up tomorrow and do it all over again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In 1991, you performed with your group Bright Moments at the Autumn Rhythms Jazz Festival in St. Petersburg, Russia. Since jazz, to put it mildly, was not an encouraged art form in the Soviet Union, how did you find the public's response to your music?
The public's response was extraordinary there. We had a great, wonderful visit. For me, on a personal level, it was an enormously satisfying experience to go to a country, to go to Russia, which is a country I had always loved, through its literature and through its music. The response of the audience at the concerts was absolutely astounding. And in fact, we found, by and large, that the Russian musicians knew infinitely more and were much more hip to American jazz music than some other countries or musicians of other countries. And they tended to play much more with a kind of feel that was much more compatible, I think, with a kind of Pat Metheny sound that seemed to emanate from a lot of the European groups. We had a great deal of interaction both at the concerts themselves, and then we used to go to the jazz clubs and play with musicians afterwards. And that was particularly stimulating. But the response of the audience was wonderful. And in some instances, some of the clubs are actually interesting, because one of the first clubs we played at has, you go outside and you have the drinks beforehand, and then everybody sort of sits. So it's almost like playing at a concert. And everybody's very respectful. But the audiences are also animated when they want to be. And there was an intense kind of excitement that pervaded that whole 8 days in Russia, which I think will live within all of us for a long time to come.
I know that my favorite place to listen to jazz is in an intimate club. In your experience, is the audience-musician interaction important for your performance?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's, you know, it's interesting because when you play in a club, you inevitably find yourself looking for, through facial expressions, the one or two people, maybe more, who are really responsive to what you are doing. In some instances, it's amusing. I always remember a guy who, after I played a medley of 7 Thelonious Monk tunes at a club, got up and he was drunk and he said, "How about playing a Thelonious Monk tune for a change?" So, you know, some people don't listen too well, but, you know, if you can find that one face there, you know, those eyes of one face who you see responsive to little nuances that you do, or the fact that you're playing a Chick Corea tune or something that they really like, then that's wonderful. And if you can find that intimacy, that's terrific. And if you are not in a position, and when you're at a club, that you have to count heads, that you're worried about how many people are going to be in there, and don't have to worry about economics, because that always becomes an issue, you know. So, but the intimacy there sometimes can be wonderful.
Do you find that there is a difference between performing live and recording in the studio?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in a certain sense, more is at stake when you're performing live, because you can't retrieve that which is wrong. And yet, it's interesting because in jazz, what you learn is to make something that's theoretically wrong, or something that you know, part of the improvisation. So that, I think, is also very exciting. The studio gives you a chance to refine things. It gives you a chance to literally touch up and brush up even the smallest little thing that has gone wrong, which in a concert you'd be inclined to just let it pass, but you have that ability to be a little bit more. Sometimes the other thing that I find, of course, in the studio is you tend sometimes to be able to hear a little bit better. There are not too many great clubs where sound systems are so artfully, beautifully done that you can hear with the kind of insight that you're able to get in a studio when you have headphones on, and you can literally hear the nuances of every little, you know, sound that comes out of all of the instruments and all of the participants. So it's different in terms of the degree of detail that you're able to get and capture in the studio.
I've always wanted to ask you, who are your musical heroes, and how did they influence you as a composer and a performer?
Well, you know, my first musical hero was Bach, because I played that as a young kid. There was something about the form and the symmetry of it that I immediately took to. The second great love was Meade Lux Lewis, a great old boogie-woogie jazz player, because when I heard Meade Lux Lewis, I decided I didn't want to play Bach anymore. Not that I didn't love him, I just didn't like playing him, that's all. I liked listening to Bach. Meade Lux Lewis was my introduction to jazz, and as soon as I heard him play the Honky Tonk Train, I knew that I was smitten for my life. At the age of 10, I remember coming home one day and listening to a piece of music that just inadvertently came on the radio. And the French horn came on with this dum dum dee da da dum dee da 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 dum, which was Stravinsky's Firebird. And I heard that ending of the Firebird, and it was like some kind of cathartic experience in my life. It was some kind of really special, unique moment where I suddenly began to experience goosebumps to this response to this music, and thought to myself, because I was pretty clear that I wanted to write music even at the age of 10. I mean, I'd already started to just do little bits of things, and I said, this is really what I need to do. This is really what I want to do. I want to try to touch people's lives in some way, and touch them in their souls the way this music has been touching me. So Stravinsky is a great hero, and I guess the other two heroes are Miles Davis, who taught me very much that the issue in jazz is not, you know, so much the notes you play, but the ones you choose not to play.
How exciting.
That less means more. And for a kind of softness that's sort of almost indescribable. And Bill Evans, the great jazz pianist who I grew up with, in a sense, because I saw him at the Village Vanguard as a kid. Yeah. And so he also impressed me for a kind of subtlety. He impressed me for his gentleness and his kind of an expansive emotional range that I sort of hope comes out through some of my musical pieces.
Was there a point in your life you knew that you were a musician, or was it a gradual process?
Well, it's always gradual. I mean, it's gradual even to this point in time today. I mean, I always feel I'm learning. I think that the wonderful thing about the field that I've chosen is that in a certain sense it's one of those things in life that as you get older you get better at. It's not,
Absolutely.
you don't feel the sort of sense that you're a tennis player at 40 who can't run as fast as you are at 20. There's a kind of wisdom that comes as you age as a creative individual, and you learn more about yourself and you learn more about the world and how to find a means of interpreting it, and you discover and refine your voice. But I knew it pretty early on. I mean, music was an inseparable part of my life. It was the one thing I always did well in at school. It was the one thing that gave me a kind of feedback that often was instantaneous. And there were very few things in my life that gave me that, other than maybe some, some literature and poetry as well. But words, it was interesting, because I contemplated being a poet at some point in time, but words were so incredibly difficult for me to produce, whereas notes, from that early point on, and even today, just poured forth from me. And I've really never experienced what this sort of a writer's block kind of thing. I don't think I've ever gone a point in time in my life where I haven't been able to produce music. It's breathing for me.
Laurie, it was indeed a pleasure. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your thoughts.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for being with us. I hope you enjoyed today's show, and thank you for watching.